Hello, I'm here doing this video today specifically if you're a Hasbro shareholder, if you have stock in Hasbro, because there's something going on right now in Hasbro that you probably want to be aware of because it will certainly affect the value of your shares. My name, my pen name that is the RPG Pundit. I have for decades been a blogger, commentator, and designer of role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons, which I was a major consultant in assisting the creation of the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is the current edition. And it is owned by Wizards of the Coast, which is a subsidiary of Hasbro, a fairly important subsidiary of Hasbro, as you probably have seen in stockholder report. Dungeons and Dragons is a game with a 50-year history, and I wouldn't want to burden you with the details of the game itself. That's not what this video is about. This is about recent decisions that Hasbro has made that threaten to severely harm their relationship with the customer base, the D&D hobby. Because Dungeons and Dragons is seen as a hobby. It's also seen as a kind of a community of gamers. And this community is actually very differing in many opinions. There are significant divisions in the hobby of Dungeons and Dragons. There are generational differences, there are edition preferences differences, there are differences in gaming style, there are differences of preferred settings of the game, and there are even, obviously, in our modern world, political differences between different groups of people with different kind of ideological agendas. So if you had asked me a year ago, is there anything in the world that could make absolutely all the D&D customers come together as one in agreement about anything, I would not have been able to give an answer to that. But today I can, because unilaterally, all of the fandom and the customer base of Dungeons and Dragons have united together in opposition to the recently leaked plans that Wizards of the Coast and Cynthia Williams, the CEO of Wizards of the Coast, have planned for that game. And most importantly, their plan regarding something called the Open Gaming License, which is what I'm going to try to explain in this video, and to explain why it has been crucial at different points in the history of D&D to D&D's success, and also how making mistakes regarding the Open Gaming License have caused terrible failures. Because that's one of the key points of this problem, is that clearly Cynthia Williams and I suspect many of the other executives of Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast are not familiar with the D&D hobby. They weren't themselves gamers. Cynthia Williams admitted in an interview that she didn't play D&D. She wasn't a historical fan. She was hired not for that reason. She was hired from Microsoft because she's an expert in microtransactions, which is all fine and good. But if you don't understand the nature of the people in your customer base, you run a great risk of causing problems. They also don't seem to understand the history of the hobby and its customer base, because if they did, they would realize that the mistake they are about to commit has already been committed twice before, and in both cases with very bad results. Dungeons and Dragons was created almost 50 years ago now by Gary Gygax, and it was originally published by a company called TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, from the 70s until the 1990s, when TSR went bankrupt. Gary Gygax lost control of that company in the late 80s. And in the 1990s, the company was run by a woman named Lorraine Williams, no relation, as far as I know, to Cynthia Williams, the current CEO of Wizards of the Coast. It's just an odd coincidence. But Lorraine Williams, like Cynthia Williams today, was not a gamer. She was the heiress of a publishing fortune, and she was looking to promote her own economic interests and taking over the company. And she pushed for very strong control over the intellectual property of Dungeons and Dragons in the community. From the very beginning of the role-playing game hobby, the hobby of which Dungeons and Dragons was the first example, and from which all the other role-playing games are derived, there's always been a very strong element of design innovation and of people making a variety of different types of role-playing games, which are all inevitably going to have similarities to Dungeons and Dragons, the original game. This is, in turn, a product of the hobby having emerged from the earlier miniature wargaming hobby that did exactly the same things. And with Dungeons and Dragons in particular, there have always been third-party companies that have made products that were compatible in some way to different extents with the official Dungeons and Dragons rules from as early as the 1970s until today. And in the time when Lorraine Williams was in charge of tactical studies rules, she engaged in very aggressive behaviors of attempting to shut down anyone making use of TSR's intellectual property, as she saw it, to the point that the company TSR damaged its own reputation among its customer base so much that its nickname came to be They Sue Regularly, TSR. And Williams had been warned by people who were actually part of the D&D hobby within her company that people would not, like some of the decisions that she was making for the game, both in terms of how she was changing the product line and in terms of how she was engaging in this litigiousness. And she famously said, "Gamers will like what I tell them to like." Not too long after that, TSR went bankrupt, and Dungeons and Dragons was under threat of ceasing essentially to exist. So this was the first situation before there was an open gaming license where attempting to restrict and control the greater hobby ended up backfiring on the owners of the intellectual property. After TSR's bankruptcy, the Dungeons and Dragons product was picked up by Wizards of the Coast, at that time an independent company, which had made themselves very successful producing the Magic the Gathering playing card game. And they purchased Dungeons and Dragons. Most of the people involved in Wizards of the Coast were themselves avid D&D gamers at that time. And in the process of picking up the product, they decided that they had to make a new edition of the game. That wasn't unusual. TSR itself made several different types of editions, and the last edition before they went bankrupt was known as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition. They had decided that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition had become too bloated, and it had gone in directions that departed from some of the most classic elements of play. And so they wanted to recreate a new edition that was nevertheless also a throwback to the kick in the door style of gaming. And so they created third edition Dungeons and Dragons, which was a great success. And alongside the creation of third edition Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast authorized an open gaming license that was written by someone named Brian Dancy, who was associated with Wizards of the Coast. And that what it essentially did was that it allowed third-party creators to make Dungeons and Dragons products and to put them under the context of the rules of the current third edition intentionally, and that they could publish freely without concern of being sued as long as there were restrictions of you couldn't use trademarked material from Wizards of the Coast. But the game mechanics, the rules, the structure of third edition, you were allowed to use them to make your own products, your own adventures and source books and what have you. So you might say, well, that from a point of view of an investor, that doesn't sound that great because that sounds like you're enabling the competition. However, you need to keep in mind certain things. First of all, in U.S. law, the mechanics of a game can't be copyrighted. This is part of the reason why Dungeons and Dragons always had imitators and third-party products, because you can copyright the name Dungeons and Dragons. You can copyright or trademark it rather. You can claim intellectual property right over certain words, but you can't stop someone from having a game that says in the rules you roll a 20-sided dice and add a bonus and you have to beat a difficulty, right? That's something that cannot be claimed as your own intellectual property. And because of that, almost anyone could make a third-party product already. Certainly, Wizards of the Coast could have tried to sue them, but it was very likely, unless they had broken some kind of trademark or some other form of legitimate intellectual property, it would be very unlikely that they would succeed. The third-party products themselves were going to happen one way or the other. So by creating the open gaming license, allowing these people to make these products under the wings of Wizards of the Coast, it made an important and a very important change to the nature of the hobby environment. Because before that, where it was an us versus them kind of perspective, especially towards the end of the TSR era, the establishment of the open gaming license meant that suddenly publishers had no reason not to make their rules as similar as possible to Dungeons and Dragons, their products as similar as possible. And what it actually ended up doing was creating an effect that Ryan Dancy described as network externalities. What that meant was, if everybody's books were compatible with Dungeons and Dragons, with Wizards of the Coast, then people are going to be buying the Dungeons and Dragons books. You're actually going to have more people getting involved in playing the official D&D rules as alongside these other manuals that are compatible, fully compatible, than you would if these people were either not publishing anything at all or were publishing products that were sufficiently different that they would literally then be competing products that you would have to choose. Do we play Dungeons and Dragons or do we play this other game? The network externalities meant that almost everybody was playing Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, and it made that edition very, very successful. Ryan Dancy included also in the OGL a condition that said that the OGL you can revise and create new versions of it, but you cannot annul the previous versions. So the OGL 1.0 could not be replaced or removed, and he did this on purpose. And the Wizards of the Coast staff agreed with doing this because they wanted to make sure that at no point in the future would Dungeons and Dragons cease to exist as a legal entity, that it could continue to be played, even if the company that owned it went bankrupt or ceased production. In the 22 years since the creation of the open gaming license, there have been multiple occasions where Wizards of the Coast, owned by Hasbro, made repeated public statements on their own web pages and other places, clarifying and confirming that the OGL 1.0 cannot be removed or replaced. You can add a new OGL and offer people the chance to work with that new OGL, but people who don't want to work with the new OGL can continue to work with the existing one. That's been explicitly stated in multiple occasions by Wizards of the Coast itself, being already a subsidiary of Hasbro. This is very important to note because it means that what Williams is trying to do with the OGL 1.1 could be contradicted in court by evidence coming from Wizards of the Coast itself. OSR 3rd edition was a very big success for Wizards of the Coast and for Hasbro, who bought Wizards of the Coast shortly around that time. And however, it eventually came to a point where the game had reached, let's say, its maximum salability, and it occurred to the people in charge of Wizards of the Coast to create a new edition. So they decided to create the 4th edition. The people who were in charge of Wizards by that time were not the same people that had been in charge in the 3rd edition era. And they came to believe that a stricter control over their own product line was going to be a better idea. You know, they made this same mistake that Williams is doing now, thinking that they will be able to generate more money if they can have a greater monopoly over the number of D&D books that are out there, and that if they can control what people are willing to purchase, are willing to write their third-party products. So with 4th edition, they instead created a new license called the game system license for 4th edition, and they declared that 4th edition D&D was not included in the OGL, which they were perfectly allowed to do. Note that at that time, nobody in any moment said that the 1.0 OGL was no longer valid. They realized that you couldn't do that. So 4th edition decided to create a more restrictive license that was more limiting. And additionally, the 4th edition rules were very different from all previous editions of Dungeons and Dragons. They were very speculative kind of rules, let's say. And as a result of this, 4th edition became deeply unpopular. And it lacked not just the changes in the rules lacked the familiarity of Dungeons and Dragons, and the limited license meant that almost nobody was interested in making additional product. Only the products that Wizards was coming out, and a very few other publishers came out with 4E products versus the enormous plethora of products that were available in the 3E era. At the same time, people who had been third-party publishers of 3rd edition D&D used the OGL to produce their own version of rules much more similar to 3rd edition rules. The most successful of these being a game called Pathfinder, which drew in so many former 3rd edition players that it ended up at a certain point out-competing 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Official Dungeons and Dragons was being outsold by a game called Pathfinder. This was obviously a big disaster for Wizards of the Coast, and after a few years, they decided to shut down 4E after a couple of completely abortive attempts to reform 4th edition, and they announced the arrival of 5th edition. That's the one that you can see here, and the one that I was involved in helping to create. It was an attempt, again, to go back closer to the roots of Dungeons & Dragons, but also to create a version of the game that was very easy for casual players to take on. That's the big difference with 5th edition. It made it very accessible to regular people who just wanted to kind of try out the game. And it became the biggest, most successful edition of Wizards Dungeons & Dragons ever. And by some arguments, you could say it might be the most successful edition of Dungeons & Dragons of all time. 5th edition returned to the open gaming license, and that was a huge part of its success. In fact, it meant that the Wizards of the Coast game designers could focus on only putting out a few very high-level products a year, while there would still be a constant buzz of new merchandise, new products coming into the hobby itself and maintaining the enthusiasm of the customer base that Wizards would not have to trouble itself to do on its own at higher risk of these products. Many of the products that are made by third-party publishers are products that would either be very niche or very exotic. In some cases, they would be more controversial than something that Wizards would ever want to publish. In some cases, they're just going to be more alternative than something that Wizards would ever want to publish. And this allows Wizards to focus on the core, the central pillar of Dungeons & Dragons products, the things that they think are going to appeal to the vast number of players, rather than having to try to cater to these other niche interests. 5th edition became hugely successful, partly because of the rules, but also because of the return of the of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons into the open gaming license, and the large number of people who have produced products on the DMs Guild, on Kickstarter, and independently that were compatible with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. As of this month, Wizards of the Coast has announced that with their upcoming editions, due to come out in 2024, the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, an edition that they call 1D&D, which is probably an unfortunate choice of name because it sounds a bit like the villainous One Ring from Lord of the Rings, which would mean Wizards would be the equivalent of Sauron in this example. 1D&D is going to be a reformatting of 5th edition rules with some significant changes. And they have announced that they're going to now abolish the Open Gaming License 1.0 and replace it with their Open Gaming License 1.1, which is in fact not an open gaming license at all, because it is a license that will mean that Wizards of the Coast will have control over who may or may not produce a product. Wizards of the Coast can unilaterally remove that license at any time for no reason that they have to explain. Wizards of the Coast will be able to demand that people who are selling a third-party product have to report their income to Hasbro, and they're going to claim a 25% royalty on products that make a certain amount of money. You might again think, as a shareholder, you might say, well, again, we want that money, don't we? But if there are all these people making D&D products, and it's a product, it's a game that Hasbro publishes, shouldn't Hasbro get their share? Well, you can argue that one way or the other, but here's the problem. Nobody is going to be willing or even able to accept these kinds of conditions. The third-party product of Wizards of the Coast are done by publishers who they're very small press, they work on very small margins. Even Kickstarter projects, some of which seem to get huge amounts of money, say $1 million in a crowdfunding, they have very, very tight margins. And after subtracting the part that is necessary for all the expenses and to pay Kickstarter, if on top of that, Hasbro demands 25% of gross income, not net, then it means that literally there's no point in trying to make this product. There's no way you're ever going to make money with these conditions. So the end result of this OGL 1.1 is that it has alienated Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro from the Dungeons and Dragons customer base. If you don't have to take my word for it, you're on YouTube right now watching this, I presume. So do a search for OGL 1.1, and you're going to see the reaction from a large number of fans. Go on any other social media, Facebook or Twitter, and search for the same thing, OGL 1.1, or the hashtag 1D&D, or hashtag OpenD&D, which is the hashtag that has been made in opposition to this OGL. And you will see that almost all of the D&D fandom have risen up against this. They don't want a setup where Hasbro is essentially going to kill third-party products. Obviously, the publishers have a very strong vested interest in this, but so do the fans, because the fans realize, the ones that are not that haven't written products themselves, they realize that what the OGL 1.1 is going to actually accomplish is that all of these game designers that were making third-party 5th edition products that the customers like, are going to stop making them, or are going to start making them for other games. And I believe that Cynthia Williams, if she even has bothered to look at the history of D&D, might have looked back at what happened with 4th edition and the rise of the competitor Pathfinder, which, by the way, whittled away its market control to almost nothing as soon as 5th edition arrived, because it was a much better alternative for most gamers. It was just that the restrictive game license of 4th edition meant that Pathfinder was able to artificially gain market dominance. But Williams may have looked at this and decided that there's the biggest risk to Wizards at this moment is that that when they're with the change in edition, somebody is going to make a Pathfinder version of 5th edition, and it will become a serious competitor to Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons. However, what she's done with the 1.1 OGL is almost guaranteed that this is going to happen. Because again, you cannot copyright game rules. So what it'll mean is that one of these third-party publishers or one of these gaming celebrities that have popular YouTube live stream shows of people playing formerly Dungeons and Dragons, or somebody else, somebody who's coming out of left field, will end up creating a competitor version, an imitation of 5th edition that is sufficiently separated from any intellectual property of Dungeons and Dragons. They will publish it without an OGL at all. Never mind the fact that Wizards is falsely claiming it can remove the OGL, it can cancel or unauthorize the OGL 1.1, which is going to hurt everybody who's making products for older editions of Dungeons and Dragons, old school products they're called, which is another big concern for D&D fans. They're going to make competitor products. It's just that now those competitor products will be sufficiently different that they're not going to be compatible. They're going to be a direct competitor. Cynthia Williams is creating the very problem that I think she was trying to avoid. If Wizards and Hasbro do not change course with the OGL, I can guarantee you I've never seen this much outrage in the Dungeons and Dragons community. I've never seen everybody, people who despise each other, people in completely different camps, people who've never spoken to each other, all of them in agreement with what a terrible idea this is. So I can assure you that 2023 and 2024 will be disastrous years for Wizards of the Coast and will therefore hurt very severely, I would imagine, the stock value of Hasbro if they don't turn back now. You as a stockholder, if you're listening to this, ought to confirm what I'm saying, get in touch with other people who are shareholders of Hasbro, and then get in touch with Hasbro and make sure that they're aware of this. Make sure that they realize what a disaster they're walking themselves into. Because if not, I guess the only other option is to sell, right? They're about to fall off a cliff and they don't realize it. And believe me, I'm the guy that was right about what was going to happen with their decisions about 4th edition. I'm going to be right about this too. Take my word for it and be prepared. I guess that's everything. Thank you for listening to me. Please share this anywhere, especially anywhere that you think a fellow shareholder will will be able to see it. And for everybody else who is watching, all of my regular viewers, thank you as always. Please share this everywhere you think someone will appreciate it. And hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. And of course, be sure to check out all of my various RPG products. And you can find the description in the link below. And as always, I thank you for your support and your patronage. Currently smoking a Castello 4K Canadian plus Peterson's Wild Atlantic.